few years ago, we began presenting disputatios on faculty recitals as a way of helping both students and faculty appreciate our live performances more fully. This is a rare opportunity for you to learn the performer's thought process, what draws them to particular pieces, and to explore the music itself more fully. Why would you need to attend an instrumental recital? With such a strong emphasis on corporate singing here in Moscow, one might be tempted to overlook the value of classical music consumption, especially when words are absent. But as a classical school, I would remind us that Pythagoras first realized that creation itself is embedded with a fixed acoustical framework, and that quite mysteriously, music has a profound impact on our emotions and even our ethics. Even though Pythagoras did not know the creator responsible for such musical infrastructure, he rightly recognized truths that are now codified and form the basis of Western common practice musical syntax thousands of years later. One of our students informed me that Pythagoras also invented the triangle, but that's another story. Music, regardless of its attachment to words then, is not without an ethical dimension. So 2 weeks ago, we explored Plato's thought and his legacy as a philosopher, and his influence on musical thought is substantive as well. Plato, following Damon of Athens, argues strongly that modes, instruments, and the character of music influences our morality. We have hardly any way of knowing what exactly Greek music sounded like, but we have plenty of modern substitutes in both the classical and popular spheres that would validate his argument. Platonic thinking about music was present throughout the medieval period, and later both Calvin and Luther appealed to different aspects of Plato's thought in their reasoning for their own particular musical choices. Later, great composers such as Handel and Beethoven wrote explicitly that listening to their music will edify their audiences. So I can give you one example of a practical application of Platonic thought. And back in South Carolina, there was a mall in Columbia that had been overrun by thugs and riffraff, if you will. Lots of crime and theft and that sort of thing was going on. And so the owners decided that they were going to start blasting classical music over the loudspeaker at the mall. And within a very short period of time, the mall's demographics had completely changed. It had become a safe space again, and business was booming. We also know from repeated scientific studies that regularly listening to classical music can enhance neurological pathways in the brain. Studies have confirmed that Mozart's music makes dramatic improvements to spatial temporal processing. There was a test a few years ago done where a group of patients were given 4 types of music. One test group was given Mozart, a second was given Philip Glass, a third was given white noise, and the last was given silence. And then they were asked to complete some spatial temporal exercises, and the Mozart group far exceeded all of the other groups. They decided to reproduce that study on rats. They played Mozart, Glass, white noise, and then silence for 4 groups of rats, starting in utero and going for 60 days. Then they put them in a series of mazes, and the rats that had listened to Mozart far exceeded those who listened to the other music. This study, other successful studies have used classical music in the reduction of seizures for patients who have epilepsy, as well in the therapy of stroke patients. So as a performer, I am sensitive to the fact that the music that I play can and does impact my audience in various ways. So tonight's program follows squarely within a tradition that has embraced the tonal language rooted in our Greek and our Christian heritages. It's rhythmically interesting and varied while still reflecting a sense of regularity. This music is good for you. It is beautiful, emotionally charged, and captures the varied human experiences within a framework that adheres to that great tradition that has defined Western music until the leading strands of classical music were corrupted early in the 20th century. And honestly, it may be that this recital will just simply be a respite for you to escape the stress of finals and thesis papers, and you don't really need some bloviated apologia for me, but then again, maybe you do. So my recital is going to feature some music from the 19th century through the early 20th centuries, and what I'd like to spend the rest of our time doing is looking through the recital, and then I will ask or offer you a chance to ask some questions. So here's the program. I'm going to begin with Schubert, which is why Dr. Erb chose the Sanctus. Then move to Debussy, followed by Brahms, Albanese, and Granados, and then end with Liszt. So Schubert is a late classical composer. So he wrote this piece in the 1820s. Brahms and Liszt are on polar opposite sides of the Romantic movement. And then Debussy, Albanese, and Granados are a form of impressionism. And so we've got a little bit of a variety here, but all of these things are going on in the 19th century, early 20th century. Here are the flags from their nationalities. So each one is from a different country. And the reason I include this is because during the 19th century, one of the phenomenon that we see is this really intense commitment to musical nationalism. So the music that these composers wrote in the classical realm often represented and pushed forward the agenda of their own political nation. So that is the Austrian Empire's flag from the time of Schubert. Debussy was French. Brahms was German, and even though he's not writing any specifically German pieces, it has that same character that he inherited from Beethoven and Bach. And then we have two Spanish composers, and followed by Franz Liszt, who was Hungarian. So the first piece I'm going to play is an impromptu in B-flat major by Franz Schubert. He wrote numerous works for the piano, including dances, sonatas, impromptus, and a set called Musical Moments. And the idea of an impromptu is it's even though it's not written on the fly, which is what impromptu would imply, it does have an improvisatory character about it. So this particular theme that he's taken is from one of his ballets called the Rosamunda, and you can hear in it a Viennese sensibility. It's very delicate and light and dance-like. And I've included a picture of, this is called a Schubertiad. So during Schubert's career, he would gather friends in these large homes and small rooms though, and perform his works for a more intimate gathering. So the beautiful thing about Schubert's music is you can play it in a large concert hall or in a small intimate setting, and it works really well. When you listen to the Liszt and the Brahms that I'm going to play, those were written for large spaces. And so if I were to play them in a small space, it would give you a headache. So when I first got married, I was playing a recital for Liszt's 200th birthday celebration. And we lived in a small duplex, and I was playing these Liszt pieces, and my wife we were newly married, and she was very, very polite about it, but it was giving her headaches, and she just thought it was awful. And when I went to play the first recital in this massive hall, she realized, it actually is beautiful music and it makes sense. And it's the context that really defines the music. So a lot of the reasons that we're going to have a different change in texture and dynamics is because of the change in space that moves from classical to the end of the Romantic era. Now, the other thing, you can see this exemplified in Austen's novels. Men didn't really play the piano during the classical period unless they were composers. So the piano was a female-driven enterprise. If you look at almost all Haydn's piano solos, it'll say sonata in whatever key, and underneath dedicated to Frau X, Y, or Z. So they were all dedicated to women, and it was the females that were playing around this time. So again, as we go into the Romantic period, the music's going to become far more robust and masculine. Some of these pieces I don't think I've ever heard females play. I mean, they require very large hand spans and are just very, very full chords. So just notice that as the recital goes on, that you're going to see a real change in not only temperament, but in the kind of textures that we would have. So let me just play the opening of the Schubert, and there will be a theme with 5 variations, which is kind of an odd number for a variation, an unusual number. 5 is always odd. Sorry. But usually it's 12. It's usually 12, and this one is 5. But I'll play the theme for you, and I'll save the variations for later. So it's very delicate and very, very much in the Viennese style. So the next group of pieces, is by Debussy. Claude Debussy was a French composer who lived in the late part of the Romantic and then really conceived of the impressionistic movement. And I want to explain what's going on with all the punctuation up here. You'll notice that there are ellipses in front of the titles, and then there's also quotations around one and not the other. So these are not accidents. So what Debussy does in the preludes is he puts the title at the very end of the piece underneath the double bar line with the ellipses. And the reason is his intention is for you to think of it as suggesting whatever it is that he's written out. So the first one is Les sons et les parfums tournent dans l'air du soir. And this is a quotation from a poem called Harmonie du Soir. And that is the title of the last piece I'm playing. So I'm using this to connect us to the second half of the program. And then the second piece is La Puerta del Vino, the gate of wine. So let me explain these pieces a little bit. So following the steps of Bach and Chopin, Debussy wrote the set of preludes, 24 preludes, one in each key, sort of. So he took all these ideas that he had come up with in the Impressionistic era and turned them into essentially a catalog showing all the different things that you can do with his style of writing. So he has lots of influences. Because he was a nationalist, he was looking back to earlier French examples. So some of you may remember we talked about the 12th century Notre Dame school and organum, Léonin and Periton. And these are two people that he was really interested in. They were the people that started writing in parallel fifths. So that's when we start using additional voices to chants. He takes that and does all sorts of cool things with it. He also looked back at their modes. You remember Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and he takes them and he adopts them and makes them really his own language. So he's borrowing these really these ancient forms of music to write his own. And we think of Debussy as being terribly progressive, and actually what he's doing is he's using the entire past to create a new musical language. He's also interested in exoticism, which explains the Spanish piece. Now this is odd. This is very unusual for a composer during the late 19th century to look to other countries for inspiration. But the World's Fair came to Paris in 1893, and while he was there, he heard Javanese gamelan music, which most of you probably have never heard. But it totally revolutionized what he thought music should sound like, and he started using the scales and techniques and the polyphony of the Far East in some of his music. And he didn't stop there. He looked to the Americas, and he wrote at least 3 pieces that were dealing with America as an exotic topic. All 3 of them, incidentally, are using African American musical forms, and so that's how he associated American music. He also has one from British, Pickwick from a Dickens novel, and a number of Spanish pieces. So let me talk to you a little bit about, back up and talk to you a little bit about the first one that I'm going to play, which is Harmonie du Soir, from Harmonie du Soir. The poem reads, "The season is at hand, when swaying on its stem, every flower exhales perfume like a censer. Sounds and perfumes turn in the evening air, melancholy waltz and languid vertigo." So in this particular piece, it's going to sound like you are peering into a room where they are dancing a Viennese waltz, and he's going to evoke sounds and smells sifting and swirling around. So let me play the opening of that, and then I'll play the opening of the Spanish piece. So that one is a bit on the more subdued side. And the second one is called La Puerta de Vino. It's a habanera. A habanera is a Spanish dance with roots from Havana, Cuba. Now, this is not to be confused with the habanero. The habanero is a pepper that nearly killed some of you last spring. I have vivid memories of a particular Tallis Myers face completely red, and as he was trying to eat an entire bucket of sour cream. So this is the habanero, and it's related to the habanero. They're both from Havana, Cuba. Ironically, Idaho now produces more habanero peppers than Cuba does, just so you know. But the habanero is a Spanish dance, and the irony about a lot of Spanish music is people think French composers actually write Spanish music better than the Spaniards do, okay? So here's the most famous habanero. By a composer named Bizet from his opera Carmen. So Debussy is also going to write this fantastic habanera, which you'll hear the rhythm going all the way through. There's Moorish influence, which indicates the Moors from Spain. And he writes that this is with abrupt, abrupt and extreme violence and passion. So you'll have these moments of really loud, abrupt music, and then really quiet. So that is Debussy. So those, again, are going to connect to the second half of the program. Now we get to Johannes Brahms. He was one of the great romantic composers. So, and I've got three representative character pieces from his solo works. So a character piece was the sort of the lingua franca for romantic composers. They were these small pieces that focus on one individual idea or mood or emotion. So as a gifted pianist, Brahms contributed a number of these imaginative pieces. And the thing that is really unique about Brahms is he's writing with a classical concern for form with a romantic imagination. So unlike many of his contemporaries, he never relies on program music, which is music that contains extra musical inspiration. His own musical power relies on this ability to create a universal beauty that's disciplined, measured, and passionate. So it's muscular and masculine, but we also have these incredible tender moments. His belief was that music from the classical period those forms had never really been exhausted. And so he does this enormous body of music that takes the work of Haydn, Mozart, even all the way back to Palestrina, and gives it new life, and shows that all those forms that had been used had never really run out of their potential. So I've never programmed Brahms on a solo program. He's always kind of intimidated me because of there's a depth and a seriousness that I have never really wanted to put forth out there. I've played it for years, but really have not ever decided to play it. I also, if you're in my studio, you know that you're not allowed to perform it until you're at least 21 because it requires a certain maturity. Now, 21 is sort of it's a metaphor, but only Elizabeth McCabe is allowed to play Brahms at this point in my studio here. So there are three pieces here. A capriccio, which is a whimsical type of piece, very fun, staccato. The second is an intermezzo, and an intermezzo is very lyrical and beautiful. This one is probably his most famous. And then the third one is his Rhapsody in E flat. So all of these fit into classical forms. You can describe them using and understand them using classical forms and even Baroque forms. So they're really quite ingenious. So I'd like to just play the opening and chippets for each of these. So you get a sense that there's three dramatically different pieces. And this is one of the things that makes Brahms so unique. He has this unending supply of musical ideas. If you listen to other second-rate composers, you realize they're kind of just regurgitating the same thing over and over in different creative ways. But with Brahms, you really have a sense that he's a first-rate composer using a huge wealth of ideas that he has in his mind. So the next set that I'm going to play is a set of 3 Spanish pieces. And we don't do a lot of Spanish music around here, but it's magical music, it's captivating, and it's really worth exploring. So unlike these other forms, we're dealing with a lot of dance music. So the Spaniards were really interested in the music of their people. There's a lot of rhythm that is infused in these sounds. So the first person is Albéniz, and Albéniz was a prodigy, traveled all over the world. He's playing with a cigar because he can. And when I was in grad school, I played one of his pieces, and it was the most difficult thing I've ever played in my life. He's a real virtuoso. And so I'm going to play 2 pieces of Albéniz. The first piece is from his book called Iberia. Iberia is his magnum opus. It's 12 pieces that are depictions of different communities and events in the life of Spain. And then the second is from a suite of pieces, and it's called Cadiz. So one of them is a fandango, and then the second is a flamenco dance. And then the third piece in the set is by Enrique Granados, a Spanish composer who is more rooted in classical idioms. And his life is pretty interesting. His career was really going well. He had an opera performed in New York, and he was over in Washington performing at the White House. And on his return, when he was between Britain and Spain, a German submarine attacked them. This was a passenger boat, and he was killed in that attack. So this was in 1916. So his life was cut short. But this particular piece is from a set of pieces called Goyescas. So Goya was a famous Spanish painter, and Granada spent some time looking at Goya's paintings and developed this set of really absolutely gorgeous pieces. And I'm playing one of the most famous ones. This is called the Maiden and the Nightingale. So here's Iberia. This is Evocation. Second one, Cadiz, is flamenco. And then the Nightingale. It's really, really lovely. It uses a different kind of rubato than any other type. So it's not like Chopin or Brahms or Liszt. It's very unique. One of the challenges of this music is there's one page where the loudest dynamic is 3 Ps, which is really, really soft. So there's one spot where it jumps all the way down to 5 Ps. So it's very evocative, and he's trying to create this really unique sound. They're also notoriously detail-oriented. So they'll put an accent on every single note or a staccato on every single note to make sure that you don't forget. So it's a very unique type of piece and type of writing. And I think that's one of the reasons that we don't hear it as much as some of the other types. So, and then the last piece that I'm going to play for you is a transcendental etude of Franz Liszt. So, as many of you know, Franz Liszt was one of the most important pianists and composers of the Romantic era in the 19th century. In and around 1830, he hears a violinist by the name of Paganini. And Paganini had a disease, basically, in his hands that made his ligaments particularly loose. And so he was playing these pieces on the violin that no one else could even conceive of. He was at a higher level than anyone had ever imagined. And so Liszt hears him, as well as Chopin, and they are like, well, maybe we could start writing this kind of music for the piano. And so they do, and they develop a whole series of what's called etudes or studies. So early on, a study would be a particular piece of music that is focusing on a single technical exercise. Some of them are very, very difficult, and they would be only for virtuosos. But as Liszt got older, he started incorporating some of his more symphonic ideas into these etudes. So in this particular etude, which is called a transcendental etude, it sounds almost like a symphonic poem. So he's writing in this symphonic language. So on the piece, we're going to start with triple P, and at one point get to, I don't remember how many Fs, 3 or 4. So it's a massive, massive sound, and an amazing use of the piano. And as I said at the beginning, this is the kind of piece written for a very large audience and a very large space, and it's going to fill the space if it's played correctly. So let me play a little bit of this, and then I would like to open up the floor for any questions you might have. Thank you. That's the first half of that piece. So I'd like to open up the floor if you have any questions, and then, oops, sorry. Yeah.
So when we're listening, is there a certain way to listen to classical music that's kind of unique? And what should we be listening for? How should we be approaching that?
So the main thing to listen for is to listen to the theme. That's your first level. It's like when you're reading a new story, you're going to be looking for the plot. When you're listening to music for the first time, you're going to be looking for your melody and just try to find that melody and see what happens as it unfolds. So there might be a change of a melody, a new set of melodies, and see if those two things are going to come back together again. So you're always just going to be tracing the melody and seeing where it leads you. That's your first line of defense. And then also just thinking about the rhythm. What is the rhythm doing? Yeah.
What does the process look like when you're assembling a program from selecting songs on the board site?
It's a great question. So she asked, what is the process? So that really varies. I mean, sometimes what you'll do is you'll have one large piece that you'll center everything around. For me, everything's pretty much equal in terms of length. And then as I was playing through it, I normally start with doing something chronologically. But when I played the Debussy next to the Spanish music, it was like almost 25 or 30 minutes of a very similar tone color. And so what I did was I broke it up in order to create as much variety as possible. So it's also tricky to do like all romantic music because there's some idioms that keep reappearing. But with romantic music, because of the nationalism and among other things, there's a whole lot of variety. So I'm looking for things like variety and making sure that there's a good pacing and that there's an arc, just like there is in a good story. Yeah, Abby.
I didn't really think about this since you mentioned it, but is there any objective standard for the number of P's and F's? Or does, like, once you get past 3, it just depends on what you think the composer was trying to get at?
It's all about, I think, trying to create a world that sort of lives in a really soft ethos. But it's all, when I say 3 versus 2, I just know that the 2 is going to be louder than the 3. I mean, and you really can't play that, can't play that quietly anyway, especially on a large concert grand and expect it to speak. So it's as much of a psychological thing as anything. Yeah, Bruce?
What would you say is required in order to understand, like, the 2 Debussy pieces that you played, which are not as melodic as some of the other pieces that you're playing?
What was the first part of your question?
What would you say is required to understand the more
Okay.
complex pieces of Debussy?
So I didn't play the parts where we do have a more regular theme, so that will come in and you'll hear themes. But part of what Debussy's doing is creating effects. He's creating gestures, and so you're going to be listening for things that feel like gestures that feel like they're swirling. So the title is "The Sounds and the Perfumes Swirl or Turn in the Air." So there's a lot of listening for those gestures rather necessarily than a clear phrase. And then with the other piece, there's a very clear melody as we get into the piece. So, but again, you're listening for the dance-like motion there, and and the feel of a Spanish habanera. Abby. It's a great question. So do I think that they shaped culture or were shaped by culture? I mean, I think the answer is it's always a little bit of both. Debussy is without a doubt shaping culture, though, and not necessarily in positive ways. These particular pieces are wonderful, but there are some other pieces that he wrote that are quite experimental and experiment with bitonality and some other sorts of things that I really wouldn't want to affirm. And what they're doing philosophically is trying to erase a sense of functional tonality. So this idea that you would have as the center of your music, that is disappearing in some of Debussy's works. But these two pieces, that's not the case. Schubert is very much reacting to his culture. Brahms is definitely shaping in that he's fighting a war against people who are trying to pervert music and turn it into something that it was historically never meant to be, which is just to tell stories. Yeah, Dr. Schleck.
In your remarks, you talked about music's capacity to temper or to morally shape space. I'm curious if you could comment on how that might play out differently with recorded music. We could actually put in a great piece, and play it on our Spotify or something like that, over against live performance. Why should we come in when we can just have a recording of it? Why should we come to a live performance? Is it going to play differently?
That's a great question. So is live performance different from recorded performances? And what I would say is live performances are not as sanitized as recorded performances. So if I mess something up in a recording studio, I can then go back and fix it. The software works just like Microsoft works. You can cut and paste and insert things. You can make the sound perfect in terms of the overall acoustic of the room. And so recorded music there's a synthetic quality to it. Live performances, I can guarantee you, this is week 7, there are going to be some wrong notes. I'm probably going to play things too fast. But there's an energy about being in the same room where that music's being created that is more organic than it is if you're just listening to it. Now, whether that affects the ethics, I'm not really sure. All the studies that I was referring to were done with recordings. So I'm not certain about that, but there is a completely different feeling when you're listening to live music as opposed to listening in a studio. Yeah, Dr. Stokes.
So who was the violinist who had
That's Nikolai Paganini. And it's called Marfan syndrome. And so he basically, it was as though he didn't have bones in his hands. They were basically elastic. Yeah, Ethan?
So you mentioned that, I forgot who it was, but he took the romantic imagination and he put that to classical structure.
Mm-hmm.
Who was that?
Brahms?
Brahms, okay.
Yeah.
So do you know of anybody today that's kind of doing that? Because the musical imagination it's got a long, it's gone pretty far since that.
Yeah, there are definitely some composers who have returned to tonality. That movement has been going on for the past 50 years, but it doesn't get as much press. There's a man out of California named Daniel Poor, who I think he's Jewish. He's written lots of psalms. He's written a set of pieces that are sort of the next volume in Debussy's Preludes. There's a guy named Lowell Lieberman out of New York. He's writing some really interesting things. So there's a lot of composers who are still writing in that traditional ethos, and they're getting more and more play. Now, just because you don't know of any good music that was written over the last 100 years, there's actually a ton of things that were written that were suppressed, specifically in the German world around the beginning of the Second World War. So there's a lot of music that was being repressed if it was not serialist or in some sort of ugly kind of sound. Yeah, Jonah?
So you mentioned that you took Debussy and Brahms and some of the other guys are looking back at previous forms and composers and sort of drawing on that. With the Spanish composers, obviously they're drawing on specifically Spanish forms.
Mm-hmm.
Were they looking back to specific people like that, or is it more doing their own thing kind of?
Yeah, so the Spanish are more, well, Albano is more than Granados is looking to the dance forms itself for inspiration. His music is very sectional in terms of you'll have one scene and then another scene, and you might not return to the previous scene, but it's very much sectional like that, whereas Granados was very much a classicist in his head, so his music tends to be more organically formed so that themes relate to each other. So, yeah.
Question about the mall. So when you think it was about the music that like drove all the aircraft away, do you think it was because we culturally associated sophistication or politeness with that about music, or is it something in the music itself that sort of speaks that?
I suspect it was both. I mean, I think just beauty is. I mean, when you're listening to beautiful music, it has a particular handle on you. I love going to Bootzer's because they have a Beethoven symphony playlist, and we go through I can listen to the symphonies while I'm working, and I think I think there's definitely this cultural association. I don't think you can escape that, but I also think that the beauty does have an effect. So, okay, last question. Yeah.
How does this kind of historical study affect your performance of the piece? Does it come a point where music is just music and all you need is what's on the page to perform it, or does like knowing the roots of nationalism and exoticism change how you actually play the notes?
It definitely changes the way you play the notes. The page can only communicate so much. And so if I just looked at this Spanish music and not known that it was a particular dance and sort of absorb that particular dance, then anybody who knew that music growing up would absolutely laugh at me. Brahms is probably the exception. You can pull off Brahms's music just by the score because he communicates so well. But I think you have to know, that there's a Viennese sensibility about Schubert. And if you don't know what that means, then your Schubert's going to sound clunky and like you have bear paws trying to play it. It's not going to make sense. So you really do have to know what's going on. You can't just sort of open up the book and start playing and everything just work out nicely. So it's very rare if that happens. Well, thank you all so much for your attention and the great questions, and let's stand and end with the doxology.